Hello and welcome to the conversation here at TRSI, the right side. And I am delighted today to be joined by Ed West,
Hello.
author, blogger, commentator, depressed conservative, son of, brother of, all sorts of things, of cousin even of, many Illuminati people. But Ed has just published a book, The Small Men on the Wrong Side of History. Now, when I saw the title, I knew this was a book I would have to buy and even read. If I am at least, I wouldn't say I'm a small man, but I'm a short man on the wrong side of history. And I thought I really wanted to find out. But before we start, Ed, I have to say, and I'm assuming here that Wikipedia is as accurate as it always is. Your bibliography is fantastic. I'm looking here at the list of books by Ed West, starting off with How to Pull Women, The Science of Seduction, How to Get Hot Women into Bed, The Ultimate Seduction Techniques for Real Guys.
That was the same book. That was when I was after university. I worked in men's magazines for a while, so I did some small, like toilet books for a publishing company. There were one of them was actually on grooming as well. I mean, grooming in the old sense of the word, which is also ironic since I'm the most shambolic person in the world. And yeah, one of them was How to Pull Women, which my girlfriend, now wife, found she said how ironic. But it's translated into Russian as well. I think as how to get hot women into bed.
You have the diversity illusion, and you have to be careful there. It's not the diversity delusion.
No, there is. Heather McDonald wrote the diversity delusion, but yeah, that's.
But let's hope you're not quite as snippy as Heather. A lot of time for Heather's work and everything, but she's always a bit cross, Heather.
Really, I've never met her. I know she gets a lot of stick from people.
Which is why I'm saying that I see this when I see her giving lectures and on podcasts and stuff. I don't know her intimately at all. Then, what I'm imagining, are these children's books?
The history ones?
Yeah, the history
books. Well, no, they're kind of like young. They can be. I think they're classified as young adult, but they're just sort of beginners history books. So there's no swearing in them. So like a teenager could read them. You could let your child read them, but they're aimed at young adults.
The Path of Martyrs, Charles Martel, The Battle of Tours and the Birth of Europe, which is suddenly launches us into the world of Catholic hagiography. It's an interesting, I don't know, pot-au-feu of literary achievement. I have a friend who was absolutely obsessed with the Battle of Tours. I'm sure I should get him onto it.
Well, I was writing some other books and it kept coming up, and there weren't any other books about it except from the Victorian era, which you can get on Kindle, which is always fun to read Victorian history books, but they seem a bit slightly out of date, and some of the language is a bit not acceptable these days. So I just thought, well, I'd write a short thing about it from what I read myself. And so as Disraeli said, when he wanted to read a book, he wrote one. So it's only a short book, but
it's an incredibly important moment in European history. And I think that if you ask people to put Tours on a map, or you showed people where Tours is on a map of France and told them that was this decisive battle between Moorish Spain and the Christian Franks, they would be amazed.
Yeah, it's very far north.
It is very far north indeed. And you think now whether or not if they had won, what it would have meant, but we don't know. But it's basically unknown. But then we come to Small Men on the Wrong Side. Now, to be honest, I got this book wrong. I had it, in the sense of my expectations. Is it in a way? It's a bit of an apologia pro vita sua. Would you say that is that right?
I wanted to do it in the personal style because. I was actually inspired to write it after reading The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt like 10 years ago. So I started to write in 2011 because I was writing at Blogs, Telegraph and occasional comment pieces, and it was very I'd be writing very much like culture war sort of angry stuff against it's us v them. And I read this book and it was really explaining why people believe they do and why people get angry, and I found it quite therapeutic. Like there's no point getting angry at people because they have different emotional flavors in their lives and they see the world differently. So partly I wanted to explain to, people, my contemporaries, most of whom are liberals or progressives of various stripes, why, not everyone thinks like them. and you don't assume that someone's bad, like an evil person, because they don't have the same views as you on all these issues. So yeah, I wanted to sort of make it a human story, because most of my contemporaries aren't really becoming conservative. I mean, I'm in my early 40s now. They all still identify pretty much on the left of various sorts. And that's kind of become the default. And I sort of noticed this as I got further into my 30s. And you think, oh, everyone becomes conservative now. We'll all be at the Conservative Club. And, I joined the Conservative Party, started going back to church, had children, all the sort of classic markers of becoming your dad, sort of, everyone does. But even other people who having kids weren't really becoming conservative. So that sort of disturbed me. I thought, well, what's the future going to be? And so the final point that made me really fully go into the book was after the election 2017, when I just realised how unpopular the message was. And the Conservatives is so badly amongst young people, particularly. It was not just young people, but like people in early middle age who were completely repulsed by the whole notion. And that's obviously one side of the story, because I live in a sort of very Remainy part of North London, and it's full of graduates, and it wouldn't quite be Dublin 4, but it would be a nice, the equivalent of somewhere nice Southside Dublin end. So maybe I'm not representative of the country as a whole, but I do tend to think that where elites go in terms of beliefs, the rest of the population just tends to follow. So that's the way things are going.
It's interesting. You use the word repulsed, and I think that's in the context of Haidt. Haidt uses disgust, as a moral feeling, and I think 2011 you were ahead of the trend there. I think Jonathan Haidt has come on a lot of people's. He's been part of that. Explosion, but with people like Doug. I associate him with people like with say Jordan Peterson.
Right. Yeah.
Explosion. Although I find Haidt, just personally, although I think Peterson does a lot of great stuff, I find Haidt personally more satisfying.
Right. I think he's great, and he's a lovely guy as well, which helps.
He genuinely seems to try and be trying to get a hang of it, trying to understand the thing. But you say repulsive. That's one of the things Haidt would say. He says that so much of this is about this. Well, he starts out with moral and foundational theories, and there are 7 principles. Conservatives use 5 principles. Liberals tend to use 2.
I think it's 6, isn't it? Unless there's a 7th been added.
I'll take it.
Conservatives are all of them, but liberals have like 3 of them mainly.
But he says the thing is when you approach sacred belief, something that people believe as a religion, not classically religious, but a belief which is essentially religious, and they have to choose.
It's triggering the same part of the brain. I would be convinced. I'd be amazed if it didn't trigger the same part of the brain as blasphemy.
He would say that if you are given the choice, if you almost between reason and your religious belief come into conflict, well, then reason gets thrown under the bus, irrespective of whether you're a conservative or a liberal or a progressive or whatever. So that we need to be aware of this and aware of how we do it. Haidt, and I think this is something we'll get into. When he talks about what brings him to write that book, it's as an angry liberal.
Right.
He's annoyed because the Democrats have lost an election. The Republicans have done it again. The Republicans seem to be better at this kind of thing.
Sorry about that. My dog's going mad. My family forced a dog upon me, and she just barks at everything in the street. Anyway, she'll stop.
So that this sense that he wanted to understand the processes involved in convincing people or talking to people about these issues, so that the Democrats could do it in an election. Then he started reading all this conservative stuff, and he started thinking some of it started to make sense. Particularly, I think was important was his insight that when we come to institutions, certain kinds of institutions, that it's an awful lot easier to break them or to unmake them than it is to repair them. That there is a fragility to our institutions or evolved institutions that we have to be an awful lot more careful about. And I think that's something maybe later on we'll get onto, because there seems to be a profligacy at the moment for no particular reason in attacking institutions, because we don't understand things we don't understand, we don't care about. We go on. Now, you refer to in the book the distinct in early Christianity. You're trying to sort the sheep and the goats, or the left and the right, or whatever, or where this impulse starts or how it manifests itself. And you refer to Augustine and Pelagius.
Yeah.
and you're saying that Augustine is Pelagius is kind of the optimist.
Yeah.
He believes the Pelagian, I suppose theologically, the Pelagian heresy is that you can achieve salvation without grace. That's merely through your own actions, putting yourself up by your bootstraps, you can actually make yourself good. You can be, whereas Augustine is very much aware of the fallen nature of man, and this is later on. You find this in Calvin, the idea of the total depravity of man. Why did you? Curious. Why did you go for Augustine and Pelagius? I think a lot of people would have started off with Aristotle and Plato.
I suppose well, partly I suppose for space. I needed to put. I wanted to sort of background on the sort of origins of left or right, so I choose them, and I choose Hobbes and Rousseau later as another. And it's obviously very binary and a simple version of it. I suppose it's because I see all politics in terms of religion. I mean, that is my central belief, really, that politics is an extension of religion, and it comes from religion. And our politics, especially both left and right, are sort of their own different variations of Christianity, and I think that has much more of a influence. I do mention the ancient Greeks briefly with Cassandra and the original realist about things going. But yeah, maybe that's my particular. I suppose that's my particular upbringing. I see it in terms of an extension, and that's why I look at the religious analogies, the Reformation and the rise of Christianity, and because I see the new thing as a sort of a new faith, really.
Do you think that politics has always been religious? It's always been a form of religion, or perhaps was it less religious in the past, or are we just going through a different manifestation? It's always been basically the same.
I think basically. It's in the Christian era, it's always been religious to some extent. I mean, I don't think you can really. I mean, you can look at personality types that quite match onto left and right, that go back a very, very long way. And the idea of mankind, of whether we're fallen or whether we're good, maps onto left or right, basically. And that's why I brought back to Augustine and Rousseau and Hobbes. But I mean, until only the 18th century can we really talk about left and right in an actual formalized sense, because before that, it doesn't really entirely make sense. I mean, were the Protestant reformers, were they left or right wing? You couldn't really exactly map them onto it, because they were quite conservative in some way and they were quite radical in others. But I definitely do think that the personality types can go back a long way into our religious roots in Europe.
I suppose if you think of the reformers historically as being iconoclasts, I suppose you could regard that as that's a left position.
Yeah, it's a radical idea. They wanted to overthrow an institution, which is the main thing. And I do look at the idea, the interesting thing about conservatism in Britain being very much a way of articulating against enthusiasm, religious enthusiasm. So by its nature, conservatism is sort of secular in Britain, because it's arguing against the puritanical movement of the 17th and 18th century.
You've read Knox's book?
Which one?
Have you read the book Enthusiasm? Have you come across it?
No.
I'm sure your mother has. It's just called Enthusiasm, and it's an analysis of the Reform movement as an enthusiasm, as a form of an enthusiasm. And I think it sounds
probably it's very relevant today, since we're having a bit of a revival of enthusiasm in one way.
But maybe anticipating the conversation, isn't one of the problems that we have today, or it seems to me that one of the problems with the current political dispensation on the left is that they've adopted this religious superstructure, but they have adopted a radically Calvinist one. When we see these people on their knees seeking forgiveness, people washing feet, adopting the semiotics of a liturgy or of a religion. Yeah. But I don't see the redemption narrative here.
Yeah, it's Christianity without redemption, isn't it? And there's some of the descriptions of at the 17th century in England when Calvinism was at its strongest, and there were accounts of people having what are clearly really extreme psychological problems resulting from their fear that they were damned, and people were going through really forms of mental torture because of there was no answer to this question, really. It was just leaving you hanging down. But there was at least a hope that you could be saved. Now, amongst the current faith, it seems like, where is that hope? There is no hope. I mean, especially if you're white, you're damned, basically, anyway, right? I mean,
But
it comes down to that.
yeah, well, that's
All you
it.
can do is whip yourself and beat yourself and hope that you'll be pardoned by some theoretical, sort of magical black person. I mean, which it comes down to.
You
It's
say
so
people,
mad. I don't even know how to. I wouldn't even know how to describe this to people. If you're stuck in a coma for 20 years, what was going on now? It would be.
you said whip yourself or beat yourself. Did you see the latest pictures?
I think that's makeup, though, isn't it? I mean, they're not actually beating themselves yet, are they? I mean, I joke these guys are like the flagellants, right?
Yeah, they are.
That, and then we're going to have the dancing mania. That'll be the next one, and we'll have they'll just start breaking down dancing until we'll have sort of heart attacks.
We'll have
the into the free spirits. It will be very, it's very much post plague madness, but
dance macabre.
Yeah, I think the next thing will probably be some sort of mass suicide. I mean, I can't even say it as a jokey way. I think there probably will be something like that, because it's so insane.
I can see why people say you're upbeat and cheerful. All right, you have that name. So
everyone who interviews me is like an hour of listening to Radiohead. By the end of it, they're just
nobody ever listened to an hour of Radiohead. Not even Radiohead. I guarantee it. Never happened. Okay, conservative. What is a conservative? Okay, Augustine, the roots of it. We have the sense of. You've got Burke, but you have a quote from Oakeshott. I don't know if you have it on the top of your head, but I think it's a quote that people use a lot. It's to prefer. The last line of the quote, if I can remember, is to prefer present laughter over future.
It's to prefer the familiar to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the limited to the unbounded, the near to the distant, the sufficient to the superabundant, the convenient to the perfect, present laughter to utopian bliss. There you go. See, I'm terrible at remembering things. Thanks for Google.
But there's a word. There's utopian.
Yeah.
There are lots of modalities we could use, but one that I've come across and I think is used is this sense. And one of the things that makes any system dangerous, whether it's left or right, is when it gets into this utopian mode. Because I don't know. It's said that Eric Hobsbawm was once asked, "Well, Eric, if it had taken another 20 million to achieve the proletarian workers' paradise, would that have been worth it?" And the answer is yes. That's the scary thing when you're talking about utopia.
Yeah.
That if we can just kill enough people, if we can just get it right, then we'll have utopia. And that's what
you never get utopia.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? You will never make anything straight from the crooked timber of man.
I mean, the Hobsbawm thing is funny because he defended Stalin right to the end. There was never any. He didn't drop. He didn't drop the idea in '56 or in '68 or ever. And also, he was a man who never really suffered any. I'm not saying he should have been ostracized by society, but he was feted and awarded and treated like a very well-loved figure in British society, and yet he supported like one of the most horrible regimes in the world. I mean, like a mass murdering regime that killed millions of people. I suppose because people still give it a pass because it was all in a good cause, wasn't it? It was. They were fighting for a noble thing, and people will allow that. They were allowed 20 million or 30 million.
At a small human level, does that annoy you? Constantly annoy you that if you're on the left, you can get away with. There is almost nothing you can say, even to this day in the discourse of leftism, that makes you a pariah on the left.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah. The boundary is not policed at all. It's very frustrating. But again, as you say, we're saying about if you're conservative, if you complain about these things, you just sound like a bit of a whinger. We have a very strict boundary about how far we're allowed to go, but it always moves slightly to the centre. So if you get caught 5 years too late, whatever. Well, you can expound any even violent organisation on the left, and it's fine. But again, it's just, partly, of course, it is because the Soviet Union wasn't as bad as Nazi Germany. But even I was at like a drinks party in our neighborhood recently, and it was around Christmas, and I just started saying to one of the neighbors, "Oh, did you see that film?" Should I make conversation? Death of Stalin.
Mm-hmm.
A very funny film. And he said, "No, I don't think that's very funny." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I just don't think it was funny to make fun of him when he was trying his best." This guy was like in his 60s or something. Right? He was living a really nice area of like North London in a £2 million house, or whatever. I said, "What?" He said he was just, he was really up against it. He was just trying his best. And I'm just saying, well, he didn't really try. He could have tried a bit harder not to kill like 20 million people.
That's
And I think when I was making,
fantastic.
what facial expressions do I make while this guy starts defending Stalin's records? And luckily, my daughter just came along and said, "Daddy, can we go now?" So but I think that's just really weird. How can you talk to a guy? He just seems perfectly normal, and he's defending Stalin. To me, that just that's beyond like acceptable, isn't it?
There has to be a dissonance in there somewhere, which is just bizarre. Years ago, I remember being in a bar, and it was Stalin's birthday, and in the place next door to the pub I was in, sort of Maria pub, was a co-op, which was a bar which was running the co-op, and it was very lefty, anarcho-syndicalist stance, whatever. And a guy came in, he was half cut, and he had a picture of Stalin, and he was waving it around and saying, "Stalin's birthday, the great man," blah blah blah. Now, he was, unbeknown to him, the bar that I was in was actually owned by, I would say, a guy who was not metaphorically a fascist. I'd say if you went into his drawers, you would have found a few black shirts, genuine, actual black shirts. But I was in conversation with a guy at the time who was the correspondent, the Times correspondent, Sunday Times correspondent for Italy at the time, who came from a Russian family, and whose grandparents and most of his family had actually been killed by Stalin.
He did kill quite a few people after all.
And it was one of those, those moments like that Marshall McLuhan moment that Woody Allen has, wouldn't you love if? And it was that moment where the guy comes in and he's giving up a stand, and you actually have to have, somebody says, and he says, he didn't really kill that many. And there's actually, you've got a guy, he said, and Selmer just laced into him. But it made not a bit of difference, because you knew that in the end, in that guy's head, if Stalin killed him, they probably needed killing.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, yeah, you can't. What's the famous thing? You can't make an omelet without making eggs, and then the responsible. Where's the omelet?
Yeah, but quite a few broken eggs by the end of it. No, I think yes. I mean, the anti-utopianism, I suppose, is the core of conservatism. It's the belief that you only work with what we have a human system should suit the human race, and we are imperfect, and we're never going to have a society free of ills. And attempts to create those kind of societies almost always go wrong. I mean, to bring it back to the current issue, I mean, today's sort of dominant ideology, where you want to call it progressivism, the social justice movement, shares a lot of things in common with communism in no sense. It has a utopian mission. This one is the elimination of racism. Again, a completely impossible goal. You want to eliminate prejudice from people. That's just not going to happen, because human beings have prejudice. Human beings are tribal, and that's one of the ironic things, is they're so determined to eliminate tribalism. In one sense, they're creating a much, much more vicious tribalism for the 21st century between people with different political beliefs. Whenever I see any of those kind of statements, it's our job to eliminate racism, saying, well, that's a sort of a relative of let's abolish private property, let's abolish greed, let's abolish the family, which was another Soviet thing, which has sort of some similarities with some progressive politics now. I mean, I don't want to over-egg it, because there are...
You don't have to over-egg it. I mean, you go straight to the website of BLM, and it's one of the explicit aims of Black Lives Matter is to disrupt the European nuclear family.
Right. Okay.
That's what it says. It's not like they're hiding it. You were very, I don't know, restrained, that you were talking about the imperfectibility and not the anti-utopian. You never actually went for the great phrase of Oglen that young American conservatives used to wear on a T-shirt. Let's not immanentize the eschaton. which, if you're going to be abstruse and difficult, I think is as good a way of doing it as anything. But basically, it means, for the listener, just in case, don't try and make heaven on earth.
No.
I suppose, to me, that encapsulates on my. I don't have pronouns in my Twitter bio, but the only thing I have is with heaven on earth we cannot make, but hell is within our compass.
Yes, we're very good as a species creating that. So that's so okay, anti-utopianism is the core one. I suppose, we spoke earlier, institutions is obviously another big conservative central belief. And, I come to it later, there is a problem when conservatives themselves become disillusioned with their own institutions, and where do they go? And that's a problem we're having now, certainly in England, and also the US.
You say in the book that you think of fascism as a form of disgust for liberalism.
Did I? Yeah, well, it's a...
Do you not think that, I don't know, it's just, there's the great Italian historian of fascism is a guy called Renzo de Felice, who's a liberal Italian Jew, socialist, Jewish historian. And Felice was always insistent, not everybody agreed with him, that actually fascism was a child of the revolution, child of the French Revolution. And, shall we say, a legitimate, intellectually legitimate response of the bourgeois to the Enlightenment and it was a positive aspirational response, in the same way as that Marx was. That he doesn't see fascism as reactionary in the same way, say, as National Socialism is reactionary. And Felice is very big on drawing sharp and deep distinctions between fascism and National Socialism.
Yeah, of course, and they were very different ideologies to start with. I mean, fascism is such a kind of mixture and jumble of beliefs as it started off. And it's hard. I mean, it's harder to sort of identify it. I think that's why it's easier just to call someone a fascist, because people don't really know it doesn't have so many set beliefs as Marxism and all these set texts. That makes it easier. Well, fascism was a bit of a jumble, and it was just, I don't know. I find it, when I've studied it, find it quite ideologically quite thin. I mean, the violence is pretty central to the whole thing, and it was sort of born out of war, and also fear of communism was,
I'm aware now that I'm trying not to be the guy defending fascism, because that would be problematic. No,
I mean, it obviously it does. It is tainted by he fell in with the wrong crowd, so to speak. We tend to think of fascism as National Socialism, which was obviously a sort of more German infused, and obviously had quite a bit of racism thrown in there.
Absolutely, and the Italian race laws are amongst the most severe and vicious in Europe when they come in. I just simply say Gentile was actually a philosopher.
Yeah,
which Rosenberg wasn't.
I'm maybe being a bit, I don't know. I don't know if dismiss is not the right word, but I only sort of touch on that sort of briefly because I need to get to the point why all conservatism is kind of sort of smeared by association with what happened in the first half of the 20th century, which is it's the one thing we can never sort of get over, the guilt by association.
Of course,
which is stuck.
And I would say conservatives have tried to be responsible policemen.
Yeah.
Since then, I mean, the likes of William F. Buckley, when Buckley makes that break and says, "Okay, this is not acceptable.
Yeah.
This anti-Semitism, this form of prejudice is not acceptable within the American conservative movement. Out." And I think we have a sensibility. I know that if I'm meeting with people or talking, when you meet people online, you're always a little bit, you're checking for those ticks.
Yeah. Is he going to be a bit of a...
Like you mentioned that scene from on the Peep Show, I think it is.
Yeah.
Which is very funny.
Friend Darryl.
Yeah. And that deep sense of disappointment when he discovers actually he's actually a genuine Nazi.
He's not just another good old sort of Tory voting guy who likes Clarkson. He's genuinely a Nazi.
Now, I wonder how many actual genuine Nazis there are out there.
Oh, I mean, like they're a tiny minority of a tiny minority of a tiny minority, but they make they attract a lot of headlines still.
Now, one of the things is, as we go through the book, it becomes clear is you're trying to understand in a pretty explicitly honest way, those underlying psychological, temperamental things that make a person either left or right, conservative, whatever.
Yeah.
And in a sense, maybe things that we therefore don't, we are the product of these things rather than we're the author of them.
Yeah.
And you talk about the big five again. I'm hearing Jonathan Haidt in this. I'm hearing maybe a bit of Jordan Peterson in this.
Yeah, this is.
To what extent do you recognize yourself in this description? In the description that people ascribe to when they look at the big five personality traits, where the conservatives are and where the like,
Oh yeah, I think it's definitely. I mean, yeah, I mean, you could. I think you'd easily probably now like analyze people from their Spotify music history, how they voted. I reckon. Openness to ideas is the big dividing line. One of the two really big ones. Conservatives just much less likely to experience novelty, do new things, go to new places, and I'm a bit like that, my friend. I wish I wasn't. There's one of the things, I wish I was much more of a naturally open person. But liberals are overwhelmingly much more open than conservatives, and that's why artistic people tend to be more open as well, and that's why the arts will always be slightly left of centre.
But there's the thing, you say slightly less of the arts.
Yeah.
We're living...
Now, obviously, I say slightly now overwhelmingly left of centre, but now we're living in strange times.
What happened? I mean, if you look at... When I was in school, a long time ago, and we were doing, say, the modernist poets, which is pretty well... And we did poetry after that, but the three great figures of the 20th century, early first half of the 20th century poetry, were Pound, Eliot, and Yeats.
Yeah.
These were not. These were not left-wing
cancelled now.
I don't know if we can even talk about Pound anymore.
Pound is like beyond cancelled. Is there a word for like mega cancelled, super cancelled? I mean,
so you have to read Pound under the sheets with a little flashlight now. Eliot is problematic.
Eliot, yeah. I mean, Eliot. He was ostracised in his time, though, wasn't he, by his friends or the right sort of thinking people in London. I bet now the difference would just be 16 million people on Twitter ganging up on him.
A friend of mine, and then we hit Yeats, and Yeats is probably the least problematical because he's kind of he's most mystically kind of whatever. Yeah. Although somebody did point out to me, he said, "God, times must be really bad." He said, "Why? People have stopped quoting Yeats."
Yeah.
So bad, because everybody likes to trot out that line: "The centre cannot hold. Yeah. Mere blooded ties, please. The best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passionate intensity," which sounds great for now, but it's so bad now that we can't even bother.
I know.
But the 19th century, even the Romantics are left wing, but their poetry has constantly produced. Tennyson, later Coleridge, so lots of conservative poets. You could argue Shakespeare has deep conservative impulses there.
Oh, definitely. That's a paradox. Yeah, I mean, lots of the arts that seems to last the ages seems very conservative, while the things we see now all have a basic, very, very progressive message. I mean, I come to it later. Even the children's books of my childhood weren't particularly. You wouldn't read anything political into them. You couldn't do really. But all the ones I get now for my kids are all overwhelmingly about how stereotyping is wrong and women should fight dragons while men dress up as nurses, and equality is good. And they all have a very quite strong political message. And this is not just me being completely paranoid, deluded, conservative, although that might play a part. I mean, I think the art world has become much more left-leaning than it was.
And it's not necessarily because conservatives can't be edgy and weird and dangerous. I mean, Swift is a Tory.
Yeah.
Old-fashioned Tory, hates the Whigs.
I think now would be there's so much satire that could be done now.
Is it possible to do satire anymore?
It's actually genuinely conservative satire, but no one will touch it. And I know the people who are I know satirists must be thinking about this stuff. I mean, like the transgender thing. You could do such a brilliant comedy sketch about a guy looking like you with a beard, identifying as a woman and turning up, and everyone's po-faced reaction having to pretend. And it's absurd. But no one would make that comedy. Why would you? Because your life would be made a misery.
But that's the question. In the contemporary world of art, is satire possible? Because I saw a blue tick Twitter account say the other day, and I'm going to try and get as close as I can, but I am paraphrasing from memory. If you are a trans woman with a penis, then your penis is biologically female.
Science. I love science.
Oh yeah, science. We all love science. How can you satirize that?
Yeah.
And when I saw it first, I laughed out loud spontaneously. But then you're left with, where do you go?
It's. I mean, everyone's laughing, but they're laughing to themselves, aren't they? They're laughing in their direct message groups, right? Because, I mean, this is why it's kind of sort of totalitarian. Not totalitarian in the sense of being, you're going to be put in a, camp or anything if you get in trouble. It's just a totalitarian. Everyone has to pretend to go along with something which is just not true, and you'll have to look like you're really enjoying the fact, and we'll have to sort of clap along. You don't want to be the last person clapping when Comrade Stalin gives a speech.
No, you don't want to be. You want to be the last one because that's trouble there. But going back to what you were saying before, the arts generally leaned left. The academy, to a degree, leaned left. Although in the 19th century, maybe not quite so much.
Even until the 1970s, not so much. It's a very recent thing. The overwhelming.
So where do you think that comes from? This super dominance. We know Jonathan Haidt has a theory about America. He says that what happens in the States is that in the academy, you have this period where after the World War II, you've the GI Bill, Greatest Generation. Many of those people are center-left, center-right, right-wing Republican types. So they maintain the balance. When they go, they're leaving at the same time as the Vietnam War, where you have the academy is either people who are actually trying to stay out of Vietnam or are actively involved in campaigning against Vietnam. So the academy becomes a place of the left, and then that becomes this process whereby it becomes more and more left, and as it becomes more left, it becomes more left because it becomes more hostile. But in Britain, that's not the story in Britain.
In Britain, well, we have a similar pattern, even without the Vietnam War. I mean, the academy in the UK, about 35% of professors voted Conservative in the late 1960s. So when the Cultural Revolution starts here, now it's below single. It's definitely in single figures, and it's shrinking. And obviously, even amongst those single figures, disproportionate number are going to be older who are moving out. So amongst the younger people, I mean, it's just conquest law and these things. Once an institution becomes kind of ideologically dominated by one group, then people who oppose that, either they keep quiet or they leave or they're not hired. I mean, there is vast amounts of evidence about employment bias by both sides. People tend to employ people who agree with them. And so once you're in an organization, you're in the common room, the coffee room, whatever, and people just instinctively talk in a way that assumes everyone else agrees with you. People with a minority view would just start to disappear, and then once the institution becomes basically politically homogenous, it then becomes politically intolerant, and that's what's happening in academia, where there's so few conservatives, they just sort of keep their mouths shut, don't they? But I think it's the same generally in the art world. Probably there's a similar dynamic going on.
We hear all the time conservatives saying, "Oh, you're not allowed to talk about this, you're not allowed to talk about that," and at times that feels a bit whingy and just not true. When you think actually you can talk about it. I mean, there are certain things, there are certain issues. Maybe I think the gender issue is a bit of a third rail because there's a level of energy in the attack that you'll get.
Yeah.
But a lot of stuff you can talk about it within certain parameters. How do you feel personally constrained in your speech?
To a certain extent. I mean, I can say. I mean, it's my job to sort of say, and it all depends on the circumstances. The last 2 months, it definitely felt ramped up a lot bit, and I've received lots of messages from people saying, "Listen, I can't for my job. I can't even say anything about the BLM thing because to me it feels really scary and slightly authoritarian, and I disagree with it." But there have been lots of people sacked over that. I mean, for people to be silenced, you don't need every single person to be punished. You just need the occasional person to have a campaign driven against them, and that has a chilling effect. And it all depends on your circumstances. If you need your job and you can get sacked for having the wrong opinion, that really is going to keep you quiet. I mean, if you're J.K. Rowling, yes, your publishers aren't going to drop you because you can make them £1 million. So, I mean, even Mel Gibson can get away with not being cancelled, and he says something like 1,000 times more outrageous than anyone because he still makes people money. But it comes down to if you're not independently wealthy, then the fear of maybe not losing your job, but being socially sanctioned in some way is is a genuine fear, and also there is just the demoralising effect when all the institutions are sort of in one voice saying, oh, we'll take the knee, or we support this movement, and if you don't support this movement, and a lot of people don't, they find it very contentious and quite extreme movement. And when I say a lot of people, I obviously mean me. That's just my way of saying me. Then
they're decent, respectable, reasonable people.
Yeah, just your average. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then you are inclined to think, well, hold on a minute, where's my representation then? Where's what about me? If all the powers that be believe something which I think is fundamentally untrue, then that's going to demoralise you in terms of wanting to speak up. I mean, this BLM thing, it sort of gets into people's, one indicator for me of sort of civil decline is when people bring their politics into WhatsApp groups, which have nothing to do with politics.
Yeah.
Local WhatsApp group, people start talking about, oh, we're gonna take the knee and we're gonna do this, and I was saying, there used to be a rule, don't mention politics and religion in pubs, because there are sort of like civil rules. People are going to strongly disagree with you, and it's that assumption that if you live in certain social networks, everyone will agree with you because everyone you talk to agrees with you.
But is it maybe something more than that? Is this actually simply also a manifestation of a fundamental difference in viewing the world between the left and the right? When Oakeshott talks about politics, for example, he talks about the world of politics and the modality. It's only one way of being in the world. There are many other different ways, and we should restrict that world to itself.
Right.
But for the left, the personal is political.
Yeah, but it's a total thing, and it goes into every area, education, and it goes into family as well. There's the classic one is people talking these very po-faced New York Times articles about, oh, this 7-year-old said to me, gender is just a social construct, and obviously these children are parroting back what their parents told them. But there was one the other day, Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's former henchman, tweeting this letter from a 6-year-old about how Boris Johnson wants to starve poor people to death. Like, who does that? Who talks to their 6-year-old like that? My 6-year-old, I think he might know who Boris Johnson is. He wouldn't have a clue about politics. He has very strong views about Ninjago and Thomas the Tank Engine, but he certainly wouldn't have an opinion. I wouldn't indoctrinate him that, because I think there is certain. Firstly, I want him to have a childhood, and there are certain areas where we don't bring politics into everyday life because it's not religion. Religion is your moral. Yeah. Your moral oxygen, your moral atmosphere, it's everything you believe in, that's your faith. So when politics takes the place of faith, then I think, you're into a very bad place.
But isn't it incredibly corrosive for our capacity to live together in a civil society when there is no space that you can go into which is not contested? Yeah. Football, in the Premiership starts up again. I don't know if you're interested in football. I'm not particularly.
No. I'm also quite annoyed about what they're doing as well.
And there is. And I thought, the largest sporting organisation in Ireland is a thing called the GAA. It's the Gaelic Athletic Association, and it runs hurling and football and those things. And it has a very, very strict rule: no political manifestations or demonstrations. From the beginning of it, it was to be a sporting cultural organisation based in the community and non-sectarian. So, I can't remember, it was the last referendum, the referendum before, somebody in one of the stadiums they brought in post banners. And the banners were taken away and they said, no, you can't do that here. And I think that's really important, because while I understand the people say, well, this is a really important issue and we want to demonstrate how we're feeling and this is a great place to get people. No, you have to sacrifice those spaces, because if you lose those spaces...
It's a shared civil space for everyone.
How can we talk to each other again? Yeah. How can I find somebody from Manchester United and say, finally... We're on the roll again, and we're going to act. Even though you tried, you brought COVID-19 to stop Liverpool winning the title. It failed. We're going to win the title, and we're going to come back, and we're going to be leading again. That'll be, but they'll bring in politics into that, into that otherwise reasonable discussion.
I remember when Robbie Fowler did he revealed his T-shirt like 15 years ago and supported the Liverpool Dockers, and they completely threw everything at him. He got fined a huge amount. I mean, it was probably only like a day's wages for a footballer. And, they all said, oh, well, football has no place in politics. And, Arsenal gave their man a telling off when he supported Uyghurs in China. And now, now they're just getting completely on board to the whole, what is a political movement? And I just think, well, why are you doing that? you're just alienating loads of your fans. This is not. You don't bring politics into every area of life. That's what happens in totalitarian societies.
But also, isn't it going to make life just plain exhausting?
Yeah,
just absolutely.
It's hard, isn't it? That's the thing. In America, the online thing is like people talk about race. They just say, "I'm just so tired, I'm just so tired." The emotional stuff. I mean, yes, it is boring listening to you people just going on about it. It's tiring.
But I'm interested in your perception of the mechanism in Britain, the mechanism which brings the arts from where it was to where it is, the mechanism that brings comedy. I'm a comedy nut. I love my comedy, and I think you say in the book or something. In the 1970s, if you looked at stand-ups in the 1970s in Britain, they tend to be what you would say conservative,
working class men from
some of it not
kind of thing.
You'd say not very nice conservative.
Yeah, no, some of them were like really quite nasty, but.
And then you have this, you have the new comedy coming in, and now we have this new comedy where people don't laugh, they applaud.
Anti-comedy, it's called.
Yes, because it doesn't have to be funny. But I don't know how scientific this was. Somebody said that 97% of stand-up comedians are on the left.
Only 97.
How did we get there? How did you get? I mean, because I'm sure it's the same here.
Yeah, it's the same all over.
Is there?
I don't know. It became sort of rebellion. Well, it started off as a rebellion, a rebellious movement. It was a young man's particular movement where, from the 60s, with the Cambridge comedians, then the early 80s, and you have alternative comedy. It was a rebellion. It was making fun of the powers that be. But at some point, these people rebellion became the powers that be, and now there's that kind of fundamental unwillingness to accept that you're actually the man now. You're the establishment.
But they love that. This is part of the narrative. They love to still describe themselves, and are described by the medium as the plucky insurgents throwing themselves on the battlements of power, when in fact they're the people in power.
Yeah,
but this is central to their identity.
You wouldn't satirize people who are actually in power, because you'd never work again. It wouldn't be very. It's like after the revolution in France, and the theatres were full of these biting satires about the Catholic Church. By this stage, Robespierre was in charge. You could say anything you like about the church. There's nothing daring then. And British comedy is very much now just it's laughing at the out group. It's laughing at particular less educated people. I know conservatives sound really boring when they go on about the elitism and snobbery of the left, because I think it sounds often disingenuous. But especially since Brexit, it has basically been that. I mean, it's all laughing about people who live in small rundown towns in the Midlands and North who are just unenlightened.
But they talk about punching up, but this is not punching up.
Yeah, it's not punching up at all. So it's just I don't know. I find it very boring. But I hardly listen to any radio any radio comedy or TV comedy anymore. But then I just wonder, is that me just becoming a grumpy middle-aged man? It's just my dad, really, isn't it?
I still do, but I tend to sort it. I tend to go for those people that it's because a lot of it's not. If a joke is funny, it's funny.
Yeah,
doesn't matter. It could be, it could be Engels. Maybe he was an absolute hoot. People stand around and God, Fred, he's hilarious. And maybe if it's funny, it's funny. My problem is a lot of the stuff it's just not funny.
Yeah,
it's painful, and you can see it coming away. And I am sorry. Do we really need another Trump joke, which is all they're saying? You come on a panel show and you say Trump is stupid, and the people who voted for him are stupid and probably racist.
Yeah.
God, that took so much writing.
It's just the Daily Mail. Yeah, it's I don't know, but I don't know what genuinely edgy comedy would be like. Would it? What would you make fun of? Or if we would just move away from political comedy at all, and everything would just be sort of, comedy of manners. I mean, that's what happened at ancient Athens. Look at classical Athenian comedy. It's all about biting comedy about this group and this group. And then you go into the Hellenistic periods, and it's just jokes about the mother-in-law and farting and, comedy of manners. Because people just got bored with political comedy. They would only take a certain amount after a while. Then they just got tired of it, I guess.
Moving on, sticking with you. To what extent, to you, is conservatism synonymous with the Conservative Party?
Tough one. I would say conservatism in Britain, or England anyway, is probably actually closer to the Church of England than That is the historic link. The Conservative Party obviously has been for a while. It's a sort of alliance between Conservatives and Liberals, right Liberals in the sort of libertarian Thatcherite sense, and that's a sort of an uneasy, unlikely alliance for a lot of time. But they were sort of, it's an anti-socialist alliance, right? So that's what the Conservative Party is for. Most people don't feel very emotional about it. They just think it's to stop socialists getting to power.
Do you think does it tell us something that Thatcher's favourite prime minister is not Lord Salisbury?
No, I think exactly.
It's Gladstone.
Yeah, I mean, Thatcher was a liberal. She was hated by people who identify as liberal, but she was a right liberal, a right-wing liberal. Her government didn't enact any sort of socially conservative policies in the 80s. I mean, I mentioned the one thing they remembered is Section 28, and that's come the Tories, but that's pretty much the only thing they did in that regard.
She had no sense.
I think that was a good idea, I should add, but it was a period of increased liberalisation on economic and social. And so, I mean, she was very much in that, and she came from a Methodist background. Even she is from that liberal tradition, which is one wing of the Conservative Party.
After the collapse of the Liberals in the first couple of decades in the 20th century, you have that migration, don't you?
Yeah,
migration of the fiscally conservative, free trade, Gladstonian liberal into the Tory party, and that then you have this. But conservatism isn't in it and of itself necessarily economically liberal, is it? I mean, there's the Red Tory tradition that I suppose Disraeli and his the famous phrase, "One England, single." What is it?
Oh yeah, from Sybil. Again, I'm terrible at quotes.
Anyway,
I sort of start, it's that kind of Ruskin tradition of, the Red Toryism, which my dad was a big sort of fan of. And that's the sort of autobiographical aspect of the book. I used to think he was sort of complete crank, really, when I was younger. But he believed in this very Red Tory vision. Britain is very pro-railway. He thought the market would destroy a lot of the things he loved if it was left to its own devices. So, he didn't trust the free market. He didn't think that's what it should all be about. He was particularly upset by the way that town planners had destroyed many cities in England. He was very anti-car, which again I thought was a very crankish thing. But as I get late in the book, and I realise I'm becoming my dad a little bit, and I think maybe he's right about that, because I think it was David Willett who coined it the conservative dilemma. That's conservative economic policies sort of end up destroying everything conservatives believe in, because it makes the world more liberal. And I think that's now accelerating. The whole woke capital thing is an extreme example of that, where big companies based in the US are pushing very, very aggressively progressive politics. And I sort of agree with the Tucker Carlson thing that big business is now a bigger threat to your freedom and way of life than big government is.
I think that's the Willett's quote is interesting, because many years ago, I was reading Schumpeter, and I'd read bits and pieces about him and read little bits. To what I understood, I don't know, but I came away, okay, he's not on our team, because Schumpeter says ultimately capitalism will fail. It will be eaten, in a sense, by the left. And he also said that there are two systems, both could work. I think he was just wrong on that, because I think he got the problem of calculation wrong.
You got a lot right there.
But the thing is, years later, I came back and I said, I'm reading exactly the same thing and thinking, hold on, he's actually precisely right.
Yeah.
That it is the success of capitalism in the 20th century produces all of this surplus wealth, this extra time, brings all of these people into education, who would never have been in education, brings them into the academy, and creates this massively expanded academy, who then look out into the world. And these are the people who form the minds and the opinions of youth going out into powerful places. And what they consistently see is people who are not as worthy as themselves being rewarded. People in the futures market, people in banking, people in insurance, or whatever it is. But people who are far less worthy than them. And they they arrive at the obvious conclusion that the system is wrong, the system is flawed and failed, and that it is precisely the success of capitalism that produces this resentful population within itself, which actually leads to its own downfall, and ultimately to a form of social democracy, if you like, of a redistributive social democracy, and an academic and cultural elite which is detached from the rest. And I think there's an element. I think that when I look around, I see anyway an element of truth in that, an element of prophecy.
Oh, that's definitely prophetic. And there's a Christopher Lash as well. He saw the system, the economic system, had produced this elite that was completely cut off socially and culturally from the rest of society, and physically as well, geographically. And they would almost, rebel against the rest of society because they wouldn't be constrained by them anymore. And that's sort of, in a sense, what's happening in the United States. Obviously, a lot of the rioting is in African American areas, but the biggest pusher is amongst upper middle class graduates. It's the elites who are doing it. That's where it's happening.
I don't know. Have you seen the work that's been done on image and attitudes to your own class, your own race? And
yeah. I mean, it's the upper middle class in America are so extreme on the left, and that's so I think all those critiques of capitalism have turned out to be pretty good, pretty accurate. And my own journey was, towards being a much more sort of liberal, conservative, free marketeer. So thinking that's, it's more complicated than that, and the market does produce these really unfortunate outcomes.
It's a weird moment, isn't it, that when you first think, you know what, maybe the most important thing in the world isn't maximizing the increase of GDP.
Yeah, especially not maximizing it by another 0.1% next year, in exchange for which you're going to have problems down the line, which your children and grandchildren are going to have to deal with.
Okay.
That's the posterity thing. That's the one word that we really do lack a lot in debate is posterity. Almost no one talks about it. It's there in the US Constitution, but politicians and anyone with an interest in the future, it should be about posterity. What do we leave our grandchildren in 50 years' time? For me, conservatism is about the issue of planting a tree that you will never see.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to, that image. And I don't think we're very future-minded in that sense. Certainly conservative governments aren't. They're interested in winning the election within 5 years. And that means keeping the economy rolling, right?
We're not future-minded, but we're not past-minded either, are we?
No. And the two are probably linked, aren't they?
Posterity, yes. But another word I'd say to you, gratitude has disappeared. Yeah. The sense of gratitude to the people who came before us for what we've been given.
Yeah. I read an interesting paper that said, I don't know how one of these psychology studies that's probably been discredited now, that have been replicated, but about thinking about the struggles of your ancestors, a good positive effect on your mental well-being. Because whenever you're stuck at your desk thinking, this is another day at my job, and then you think, well, okay, my great-great-grandfather, was making matchsticks in a factory, being blinded by whatever it was, dying age 36 of iron lung. He did that so I could get this far. Yeah, I mean, it takes many, many years to get a civilization as advanced as ours in the state it is for us to enjoy it. And we should enjoy it. And it's much easier to knock these things down than it is to build them, which takes a long, long time.
There is something bizarre, almost pathological about the sight of a young person in Yale talking about the fact that they're exhausted by having to live in that racist structure every day, basically just trying to stay alive.
Yeah, it's just so hard. I mean, living in Connecticut and
you're part of the 0 point. Here's something. It's optimistic? Is it optimistic? Maybe anyway. You said that you were talking about finding political home and the evolution of politics. Where did people go? And politics had in a sense has stuck in a lot of the Western world. There's this. Everybody seems to be singing off the same hymn sheet ultimately, with very little difference. Leaving aside the rights or the wrongs of the issue, Brexit has thrown some cats amongst pigeons. If you look at the way the values, you had a captive Labour vote in parts of the Midlands and the North. which, because it could not imagine itself voting anything except Labour, was essentially powerless. Because they, in the same ways, the Democrats can assume they will get the African American vote. So in practice, they don't actually have to do anything for them because it's there. But as the Labour Party in the Southeast has become more progressive and less, shall we say, Methodist socialist, the capacity of someone like Johnson, or the capacity for the Tory party to move to the left on economics while staying, shall we say, conservative and social on more social issues, has created an opportunity, hasn't it?
Yeah, they were very. It turned out. It turned out very well for them electorally because this. There was this kind of seismic movement in the political scape happening anyway, and it's been happening since at least the 1990s. Really, it's now called the Great Realignment, which is where the various economic and social reasons, the sort of middle class is moving to the left and the working class moving to the right. And it's already happened in the States with the Republican Party becoming the sort of more working class party. And that was going to happen anyway in Britain. But Brexit just basically sped it up really, really quickly because what it did was just create these two new political identities, which people felt much more comfortable identifying with and much more strongly about. Whereas people would never, long-term Labour Party voters would never have thought themselves as voting Tory. They could identify as Leavers or Brexiteers, whatever, until the moment came where the Tory party became the Brexit party. Then they would vote for them. So on electric, and it's easier because Labour, all the social studies, Labour Leave voters, and about a third of them voted Leave, had social values about the same as Tory Remainers. So they're quite conservative, and they always were conservative. That's one of the things I always, what surprised me when I was a kid. There was lots of, my parents had a lot of Labour friends, but they're also London Labour voters, who sort of worked in journalism or the theatre. I think they were what Ken Livingstone called metropolitan perverts, with very liberal social views. And then when I grew up, when I left school and actually met people from different backgrounds, and I met, working class Labour voters, and I realised they're like easily as right wing as I am, like on every issue. They just want, they want everything distributed more fairly as they can see it. But on any kind of a social issue, easily as right wing as I am. They weren't at all unconservative, or certainly weren't liberal. So I suppose, so they were able just to, that was able to realign the party. And the Tory alliance was sort of lucky in that they were more united and they just happened to have just the right number of votes. And they had a completely useless opposition, which always helps, doesn't it? Corbyn, I thought, was very extreme, but he was also terrible as a leader. But if you in 1997, most of these seats that the Tories won, they were, there were 65%, 70% Labour voting areas. They're overwhelmingly Labour voting, like mining areas. It would have been unimaginable for Tories to win those areas. And
as the addict does, I'll watch any election results night. I don't care where it is, Kazakhstan, and I was up watching the results coming in from Britain and from in the last UK election, and results were coming in from mining villages on the coast of the northeast, where literally it'd been Labour since the seat came into existence in.
Since people were giving the vote, it's been Labour. Since the 20s, all these places, Blythe Valley, Don Valley, all these places were, strongly Labour. It'll be interesting to see. Because I'm Brexit, I have very mixed feelings about the whole thing. There could be a big economic cost involved in it. It could turn out to be a bit of a mirage for many people, I think. And there are a lot of contradictions between the sort of different types of supporters of Brexit. So I don't know, everyone's going to be happy.
Have you got your second passport yet?
I used to have an Irish passport. I just couldn't be bothered to renew it. It wasn't actually out of any principle. Actually, the reason I had to get a British one, I had an Irish one only until about 20. Mum always said it's always useful to have an Irish passport in case you're kidnapped. If the plane is hijacked, it could be very neurotic. This is in the 70s, obviously. If the PLO hijack your plane, you're Irish, they might let you out. And obviously, if your plane's hijacked now, it doesn't matter what passport you got, you're finished. But I think it was a bit more. But it's fine. When I went to Trieste, I got a massive upgrade in my room, a huge, enormous room, because I had an Irish passport. I said, because we love James Joyce. Like, great.
I was offered his job.
James Joyce's job?
Yeah, at the University of Trieste. lectureship. I was offered his job, but it paid around £3.50 a week. So I said no, thanks. They said, but it's James Joyce's. I said, yeah, but it was still £3.50 a week.
Yeah, I suppose they're relying on the prestige a little bit, aren't they?
Well, Italian universities, unless you're actually a professor, right, the money is rubbish.
Big shoes to fill as well, isn't it? It'd be like following Alex Ferguson, isn't it? A little bit. You're just like, I don't want to. Whatever I'm doing, I'm not going to do it. Really.
Yeah, I don't know. I have mixed feelings about Joyce. I think Portrait is a great book. I think.
No, I find it completely incomprehensible. But he is the most. Everywhere in Trieste is like.
Just the last bit. I wanted to just talk very briefly about the situation, the madness of today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the context of an earlier about the diversity illusion, where you talk about the failures of the policy, the failures of immigration policy in the UK, and you describe, for example, the windward in the aspect. The expectations of what would happen and then the reality of what actually did happen, numbers-wise. And I mean, famously, Frau Merkel said when she talked about guest workers, the Gastarbeiter in Germany, she said, "Oh, we never thought they'd stay."
Yeah,
which is a little bit behind there. Okay, the old joke about you get lost somewhere in Kerry, and you ask a local for directions,
and you don't want to start from here.
Yeah, if I was going there, I wouldn't start from here. Obviously, I suppose there's a sense of that in the UK today. Surely, okay. In practice, the UK is not in the same place as the United States. It doesn't have the same cultural, historical context as the United States, and in many ways, if you look at across many metrics, race relations in the UK are better. If you look at, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing these days, but I know if you looked at the figures a few years ago for women, say, from an Afro-Caribbean heritage, the number of them who are in relationships with men who were white British was like 50%. Mm-hmm. So there's an incredible amount. And if you talk to people friends of mine who started having families in London in the 90s, they would say that the children going to the local school were genuinely colorblind. Mm. Colour wasn't an issue. What I find weird and worrying in Ireland, and I think it's happening, is this desire to import an American model, an American optic of what the problem is and of how we go forward. How do you see the issue in England today? How is it? What is the situation? Well, and allow me that you wouldn't start from here, but this is where we have to start from. Where do you go?
I think the wouldn't start from here issue is that no one who ever comes up with any policy ever accurately predicts what's going to happen. And then once something has happened, it's facts on the ground, and they say, "There we go, it's there now. What are you going to do? You can't complain about it. It's happened." The problem we're now seeing, and it's a kind of acceleration of something that's happened before, especially with this protest. Okay, there's a man killed by police, possibly murdered by police, in a city 5,000 miles away from us. Mm-hmm. I haven't been allowed to see my mum. No one's been allowed to go to funerals of their family. No one's been allowed to do anything. We've all been in lockdown. Most people have paid it pretty much. 10,000, 100,000 people are allowed to turn up in London, break down lockdown, and do a protest about a man being killed 5,000 miles away in a city which has nothing to do with us whatsoever. We have no control. And no one seems... And Labour politicians went to this, and the Mayor of London didn't tell people not to go. The police, one of the senior police in London said, if you're compelled to go, wear your mask. You're compelled to go to a mask. No one's compelled to go to a march. So it's okay to completely break all the rules about a contagious disease and risk the lives of other people so that you can protest about something going on in another country. And then when I say to people, so, okay, you cannot possibly change anything that happens in America. America is a violent country and a violent continent. Police all across the Americas kill people in very large numbers. In Venezuela, they kill them hundreds of times in the United States. In Jamaica, they kill them in 400 times the rate of the United States. In Brazil, likewise. Very similar numbers. This is just one violent country and a violent continent. What has it got to do with us exactly? And then the argument is, it's just racism generally. Okay, so it's just racism in the abstract. In what sense does the abstract racism of what happens in Britain or Ireland or Denmark or Holland, how is that compared to the story of the United States, which has a completely different history and a completely different narrative? But their history is now completely almost cannibalizing our history. British people's history is being rewritten as American history. I mean, this is the annoying thing. My kids, my eldest, came back from school age at the end of age year 3, is it? Year 3, when she's 8. She'd learned 3 historical characters in school: Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and Rosa Parks. Right. So Rosa Parks, why is the Rosa Parks story? That's a very powerful and compelling story, the African American story. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, the march to Selma, Alabama. But that is not our national story. It's completely another people's story, and it's almost nothing to do with us. And it doesn't actually have much bearing on the history of race relations in England, which are completely different. I mean, anyone who knows anything about England will know that as much there was prejudice and racism as there is in every society, which is hard to explain to people, the story in Britain was just complete. There was never, ever the colour bar issue that there was in the United States. We have our entire system, discrimination laws came about because American servicemen objected to being in the same hotel as West Indian cricketer, and the British judge threw it out because he says there's no history of segregation in Britain. That is not the right. There aren't rules against intermarriage. So all those things, and I do generally wonder what percentage of young British people think there used to be segregation in Britain and there used to be lynchings in Britain. I think we've entirely imported American historical narrative into our own history, and I think it's gonna spread soon. So in a sense, it's sort of LARPing. I saw one picture. There's a black woman in Dublin. It might be Dublin, might be Cork, and she had a sort of placard saying, "Am I next?" As in, "Am I going to be shot next?" I mean, the guards last killed someone in 2000 who had serious mental illness problems, and he was firing a sort of shotgun at them. So, how many people have the guards killed down the years? I mean, your chances of being killed by them are astronomical. It's just complete play acting, and it's actually dangerous play acting because you're giving people this idea that they are living in this Netflix series that is US politics and US cultural life. And by doing so, they're going to fulfill that prophecy by making that division happen.
I was saying
to
a friend from me recently that there is a sense that these people are as much victims of American cultural globalization as the little girl that desperately wants the Disney princess doll.
Yeah, it's a fantasy they're being sold, and
they've bought into it, and it's bizarre. And I think it's really worrying and dangerous because, all the usual things. There are racists here, and there are racist acts, and that's bad. And we have laws, and these things shouldn't happen. And we should teach. Also, how many children in Ireland was? I don't know if you remember. If you ever came over when you were a kid,
all the time.
It was historically a very, very monochrome kind of a place. But in this, back from the 80s and the 90s, we consumed the BBC, we consumed American TV, Hollywood. Irish children grew up knowing, even if they didn't know anybody who didn't look quite like them, that racism was a very, very bad thing.
Yeah.
The old wild saying, if you want to make war, get rid of war, don't make it immoral, make it unfashionable.
Yeah.
And I think there's a deep truth to that. That for most young people, and the vast majority of young people, and I say young, I mean that people slightly younger than me, racism is just a bizarre notion, and it's wrong and deeply uncomfortable. And if we impose, and we have somebody here saying, okay, you may not be killing us, but you've got your foot on our back.
Yeah,
and there's a demand that we feel guilty. We're being told, the Irish are being told at the moment, we should feel guilty for the way we've profited from the slave trade and the exploitation of Africa.
Yeah.
And that's just, and my worry is that you're going to say to people, many of whom just don't feel guilty and who won't, say, you create resentments. Douglas Murray says, and I think he's right, race is a dangerous thing to start playing around with for the sake of political gain or advancement. Don't want to play this game.
It's, I mean, my problem is, and I think I do address, the book's so long ago now, I can't remember, but there are unfortunately incentives in place that means that people will always play that game. And how do you stop people continually playing it until it makes just at best just constant arguments, at worst something else. There are whole structures. I mean, the BBC, the radio, every day, usually there'll be something about, there's inequality at this rate, there's inequality at this thing. So universities aren't allowing enough people here, and the police are arresting more people. So there's this pursuit of equality of outcomes, which is itself impossible to achieve. But also, inequality of outcomes is fine if minorities do better than the average. That's great. Britain's amazing. That these people are so hardworking. If they do worse than the average, that's outrageous. We must have more. More work needs to be done, as that terrifying phrase goes. So
we need to have a conversation.
It's just, what is the end point? The only end point is where every minority does better than the average at everything. And until that happens, there will be constant striving for perfectibility. But also, diversity is going to always increase unless someone doesn't increase it. Even without immigration, it's going to constantly increase. The point is, at what point are people allowed to say, okay, that's enough? Is there an end point? Is anyone actually allowed to say, that's enough now? I think the country's changed enough as it is. There is no end point. There is no acceptable point to say that, because even if however gently you phrase that, it makes you on the wrong side of history, to use a phrase. Diversity is always good. So if something is always good, then there must be more of it always. There must be always more pressure to have more of it. And if equality is good, by which equality they mean more, basically white English people doing worse relatively, then that must always be pushed forever. There's no sense that things are actually usually a trade-off. I mean, and that's, again, that comes down to the utopian idea. Equality and diversity are trade-offs with each other. They go against each other. That has been known since the beginning of time. Diversity used to be another word for inequality. We were talking about the diversity of talents of people.
Yeah.
And diversity goes against solidarity in a community. The more diverse it is, the less people care about communal, shared institutions, and the less they care about things. So these things counteract with each other. And I do sense there is, with this BLM thing, I mean, everyone just, the non-player character response, that sort of phrase about, oh, well, BLM are just against racism. They're just against racism, so you must be against racism. The BLM marchers go through London, and people see footage of 3 young black guys setting fire to Union Jack on the cenotaph, which is the memorials of all our grandfathers and great-grandfathers who died in the war. So how on earth is that going to reduce racism exactly? That's the most... Nothing about these demonstrations has reduced hatred on any level between politics or different groups. It's not going to end in a happy way.
Okay, and we'll finish on this with it. Okay, if it's not reducing racism, is it possible that it's not really about, it's not about that anyway, but this is rather some kind of a liturgy or a performance, and that people are engaging in it purely for some kind of psychic sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's really... Words. I mean, the analogy about the elephant and the rider. I mean, the rider's been... The elephant's run off long ago, and the rider's been found in a ditch somewhere. I mean, this is emotions controlling. You can show people all the statistics they like about police shootings and race, because they say it's about race and police. There's loads and loads of statistics about violence amongst the police and amongst criminals in the United States, which shows it's a very, very contentious issue. Whether they are more likely to profile and shoot African Americans, it's a very thin thing. America's a very violent country. But there's no way of even bringing this issue, even raising that issue rationally to people, it's just going to make no effect whatsoever, because this is a deeply emotional issue. Racism is wrong. It's the most central wrong thing. Quality of outcomes between groups is a sacred value. I mean, that is the central thing of the Great Awakening, is about all groups are equal. And if there is an inequality of outcomes, it must be down to some systemic or systematic institutional racism, which is completely unfalsifiable, and it is a priori correct and true because we say it's true, and if you disagree it's true, you must be in denial. These are sacred values, and now we see the more crazy extreme examples, the people, the sort of mock flagellation, and those white people holding guards, so there can be a black people only garden in Seattle. I mean, anyone I mean, I'm sure most people with reasonable goodwill and sanity look at that and say that's not really a healthy development. Those are people with sort of psychological issues, which have been somehow channeled into their view of race. It's a kind of weird cultish movement.
Well,
but I think it's more. I think it's not an isolated cultish movement. It's the extreme variation of a quite widespread cultish sort of
widespread, but not, I suspect, happening much in China. Anyway.
No, I mean, the irony of is, the obsession of, the New York Times led Anglo commentariats, their obsession with white racism, with white supremacy. What it really is white narcissism, because it's all about people who've grown up reading To Kill a Mockingbird, and they want to be the savior and the goodie who saves the helpless person of color from the white racists. They're not interested in racism when it's in the Middle East or China or India. And these countries are far, far more racist than the United States, especially the United States or Western Europe. I mean, by any measurement, if you came up with these suggestions in China or India or the Arab world, we're going to empower these minorities and we're going to put up statues of black people and we're going to, East Asians shouldn't be dominant. It would be beyond laughed at. It would be so absurd an idea, but it's a kind of white narcissism that we are these more enlightened people, that we're going to go above these human prejudices and eliminate them and save the world. It's a very strange.
Indeed, but saving the world is always a good place to end. However, next time we're talking to Ed, he's going to be telling us about his happy fun time side when he's
And I'll teach you all about how to pull women.
How to pull women, and his plan to save the world, which he says apparently it's an absolute cracker. But until then, I'd like to thank Ed West for this conversation. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and hope to see you soon in the future. But for the time being, stay safe, and bye-bye.